Have you ever wondered what it really meant to wake up in the 9th century? Not as a king, not as a god-touched hero, but as a woman with a sword. Not in a saga, but in the smoke of a longhouse, the stench of wet wool, and the quiet pressure of duty wrapped in iron and silence. This isn't the story of glory, not the kind sung by skalds or carved into runestones. It's the story of what came before and after, too, the legend. Of the bruises that didn't make it into poems, the hunger that came before the feast, the training that made your knuckles bleed, long before your name meant anything at all. Tonight, we won't just visit the world of the Vikings. We'll crawl inside it. We'll sleep on the floor beside their dying embers. We'll taste what they called food, and learn why the gods didn't always answer. This is the story of a shield maiden, not the fantasy, the reality. And if you're ready, take a breath and step into the cold year of 873 AD. You wake up in 873 AD, and the first thing you notice is that your neck hurts. That's because you're sleeping on a wooden bench that doubles as a bed, a seat, and a place where the village elder once died. Your pillow is a lump of straw wrapped in rough wool. It smells like goat and disappointment. Outside, the wind howls like a funeral you haven't been invited to yet. Inside, the longhouse breathes. Not like a person, like a beast. A slow, groaning thing made of smoke, sweat, damp wool, and breath so stale it could legally qualify as a historical artifact. You're not alone. You never are. 10, maybe 12 people sleep here, plus livestock, plus a few souls you're not sure are still alive. You blink and inhale. Big mistake. The air is a soup of smoke, dirt, human skin flakes, fermented meat, and something that might have once been a fish. Welcome to your life as a Viking Shieldmaiden. You don't get to ease into it. There's no onboarding, no tutorial. The game started before you were born, and the difficulty setting is stuck on hard. You are female, you are armed, and you are already late. Outside, someone is yelling. It's either a call to arms or someone found mold in their oats again. Either way, you're getting up. You wrap yourself in layers that could politely be called clothing. Wool, fur, leather, and enough smell to ward off both spirits and marriage proposals. There is no mirror. Your reflection lives in a puddle near the pig trough. And even that has more dignity than your morning face. You step outside. The cold hits you like a tax collector, with something to prove. Your breath becomes fog, your fingers become lies, and your spine regrets every life choice. The village is awake. That is to say, everyone is moving, but no one looks conscious. Children run barefoot in the mud. Adults mutter prayers to Odin while trying not to drop their axes. Somewhere, someone is already drunk. This is normal. You don't question it. You just keep walking. Because in 873 AD, standing still is how you die. Not dramatically, just quietly, and probably in the mud. You reach the practice field. It's more of a clearing where grass has given up. You draw your sword. It's not fancy. It has a name, but you can't pronounce it. And frankly, you think that's pretentious. Training begins. Your instructor is a man with one eye, half a beard, and a voice like a dying crow. He tells you to fight like you mean it. You do, because he's watching. And because last week, someone didn't, and now they're using her shield as a chopping board. You swing, you block, you bleed. It's not dramatic. It's Tuesday. You don't have time for poetry. Only repetition. Hours pass. You stop when your arms stop listening. You drink water from a horn that still smells like its previous owner. You eat bread so hard it could be used in construction. Lunch is not a break. It's a delay. After training, you have chores. Yes, even warriors do chores. You carry water. You mend a fence. You pretend not to notice the severed head nailed to the gate as a warning. It's not yours. That's the important part. Afternoon becomes evening. You gather in the longhouse. Someone plays a lyre. Someone else butchers a goat. It's the same person. Multitasking is key. You sit by the fire, which smokes more than it burns. You hear a saga. It's mostly yelling and vague threats, but people seem entertained. You eat stew that tastes like regret and bone. You laugh. Or at least, you show teeth. The night drags on. You wrap yourself in your cloak and lie back down. Your feet are still cold. Your sword is beside you. So is someone else's elbow. You close your eyes. Tomorrow, you wake up and do it again. You are a Shieldmaiden. You live, fight, eat, bleed, and sleep without comfort or complaint. Not because it's glorious, but because it's Tuesday, and there are no pillows, only war. Home is a longhouse. And by home, we mean a large wooden box full of strangers, livestock, and suspicious drafts. It's not cozy. It's not quiet. It's not yours. Privacy is a foreign concept, and comfort is a lie invented by later centuries to sell furniture. You sleep with your family. You sleep with your neighbor's family. You sleep with your neighbor's goat. Not by choice, but by proximity. The walls are made of timber, daub, and whatever else didn't catch fire last winter. The roof leaks strategically, avoiding only the places no one sits. The hearth in the center smolders more than it burns. And if the smoke doesn't kill you, the soot will give your lungs a warm blanket of carbon. Inside this communal shoebox, life happens in layers. First, there's the snoring. Dozens of human beings breathing, grunting, and whispering in their sleep like an orchestra of regret. Then there's the animals. Chickens, goats, pigs, sometimes all three depending on the season. They snore too, louder, and they don't apologize. You don't have a bed, you have a plank. If you're lucky, most nights you sleep on straw that hasn't been dry since the last solstice. You share blankets, you share space, you share litter. The idea of personal property ends where your neighbor's elbow begins. Everything smells like damp wool, boiled turnips, and choices you didn't make. There's always someone cooking, someone carving, someone arguing about firewood. And yet, despite the crowd, you will never feel more alone. The longhouse doesn't echo, it absorbs. It swallows your thoughts and burps out noise. If you want to think, you go outside and risk frostbite. If you want silence, you wait until everyone's asleep, and then lie still, hoping the goat doesn't sit on your head again. You live here, not because it's ideal, but because it hasn't collapsed yet. That's what makes it home. Your daily routine is not a schedule, it's a siege. You don't wake up. You are dragged into the day by obligation, and the sound of someone already sharpening something. The sun is a suggestion. The rooster is unemployed. You are awake because the air is cold. The chores are loud. And sleep is a form of cowardice. You start with training. Always. Training is mandatory, unrelenting, and the closest thing you have to religion. You spar in the mud, where gravity is just another enemy. You lift shields until your arms scream and your thoughts go quiet. Your sword has not been polished since last summer, and your boots have more holes than logic. But still, you fight, because repetition is what keeps you alive. You block like your ribs depend on it. You swing like the world owes you. You fall, you rise, you bleed. That's how mornings go. Then comes food, a word used generously. It's a ladle of something grey, a bite of something brown, and the occasional mystery root that makes your jaw lock up. You eat because hunger is louder than taste. You chew because digestion is non-negotiable. The afternoon is not a break. It is punishment by productivity. You carry logs. You fix thatched roofs with frozen fingers. You skin animals that smell like failure and stew. You fetch water from a river that hates you. You chop wood until the axe blames you for existing. You are a Shieldmaiden, but you are also a mule, a carpenter, a laundress, and an involuntary apprentice to every trade no one else wants to do. You don't complain. Complaining is a luxury. So is sitting. You save your thoughts for later. They can scream when you're alone. Evening is worse. Evening is laundry by firelight. Evening is sharpening your blade while your back muscles plan a revolt. Evening is pretending that your hands don't shake and your knees don't mutter curses in Old Norse. You clean your gear, clean your wounds, clean the blood off your shirt and hope it's yours. Then you sit by the hearth. next to people you bled beside. No one talks about it. You listen to stories that are half memory, half threat. You nod. You eat again. The stew tastes like something you regret, but it's warm. That counts. You fall asleep with your sword nearby. Your muscles twitch. You dream of falling. You dream of fire. You wake up with a start. It's not dawn yet. Someone's already yelling. And just like that, your routine begins again. There are no days off, only new assignments. A rest day is a myth, like dragons or clean socks. If you're not training or fighting, you're reinforcing the palisade. If you're not hauling firewood, you're hauling someone's wounded brother. If your hands aren't bleeding, it's because they're frozen, and that's somehow worse. Your downtime is just uptime in disguise. One moment you're chewing bark that pretends to be bread, the next you're sent to gather moss for bandages. It's not glamorous. It's not even acknowledged. You do it because it needs doing, and because someone will yell if you don't. Tasks are assigned by hierarchy, necessity, or who's unlucky enough to be standing still. You once stepped outside to breathe and got roped into scraping hides. You spent the next 3 hours questioning your life and your sense of smell. But that's life here. You're either in motion or in trouble. If you're lucky, you only smell like goat by the end of the day. If you're unlucky, you also smell like fear. Shield maidens are warriors, yes, but warriors are not exempt from drudgery. You're expected to know how to kill a man and how to tan leather, sometimes in the same day. You learn to swing a blade and a hammer. You learn to fight with grit and cook with ash. You are multi-talented by necessity, not because it's noble, but because there are no specialists, only survivors. The closest thing to a break is mending chainmail, which, if you've never done it, is like threading needles made of regret. It takes hours. Your fingers bleed. Your patience disintegrates. But the links hold, and that means something. You're not allowed to complain, so you don't. Instead, you sigh aggressively. You mutter at your tasks. You curse the gods quietly. It's therapeutic. Kind of. The work is constant. The hours are eternal. And the reward is that nothing collapses. You count your successes in things that didn't catch fire, in walls that still stand, in the fact that you didn't cry. Much. Today. Tomorrow will be worse. You know it. Everyone knows it. And that's the beauty of it. Misery loves consistency. You live in a longhouse. That's the formal term. It sounds official, architectural, even impressive. It is none of those things. It is a single, elongated box of timber, dung, smoke, and noise. It houses not only you, but your family, your extended family, your neighbors, their goats, the goats' fleas, and secrets that smell worse than all of them combined. The walls are made from wattle and daub, which sounds like a charming Nordic dessert but is in fact a mixture of mud, straw, and manure, slapped between wooden slats, in a method that could be described as structurally hopeful. The roof is thatched, which means water leaks in different places depending on the angle of the rain, and sometimes snow just enters uninvited through sheer persistence. There are no rooms, no partitions, and definitely no privacy. Everything you say, do, or fail to do is heard by someone snoring 3 feet away. The hearth, placed deliberately in the center of the building, serves as the only source of heat, light, and optimism. It also serves as the source of constant, eye-watering smoke that doesn't rise conveniently through a chimney because there is no chimney. The smoke just accumulates somewhere near your forehead and then settles into your lungs, your clothes, your bedding, and eventually, your soul. Speaking of bedding, you sleep on a wooden plank or, if you're lucky, a makeshift mattress stuffed with straw, which provides about the same support as an old sack of onions and twice the lice. These lice are community members in their own right. You do not get rid of them. You negotiate with them. You shift, they shift. You scratch, they relocate. The longhouse is divided in theory, not in practice. One end might be for humans, the other for livestock. But by the second week of winter, everyone is sleeping where there is warmth, and no one is counting hooves anymore. You sleep next to your cousin's husband, their children, a pig, and a goose with boundary issues. People snore, the pig farts, the goose stares at you through the dark. The air is a dense stew of wood smoke, damp wool, and people who have not bathed since the summer solstice. There is no ventilation. There are no windows. There is only the faint hope that tomorrow the fire won't go out. The fire going out is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency. Relighting it involves coals, prayers, and the same desperation you'd use to rescue a drowning family member. If it dies during the night, you do not merely wake up cold, you wake up dead. The longhouse does not protect you from the elements. It simply delays their arrival. Wind snakes through every crack and crevice. Rain pools on the dirt floor. Snow finds creative ways to join you in bed. You cover yourself in as many layers as you can find, which includes your clothes, your spare clothes, other people's clothes, and sometimes a dead animal. If you're lucky, the dead animal is still warm. Meals are taken beside the fire, which is convenient because it's also the kitchen, the living room, and the drying rack. There is no table. Food is passed by hand, dropped, picked up, wiped on a tunic, and eaten. You eat with the same fingers you use to clean your nose and prod the goat. Conversation is limited. There are only so many things to say when everyone is in the same room all day. Most communication is non-verbal. Coughing, scratching, grunting, or sighing deeply while staring into the smoke. Children cry. Elders mumble. The goat is always awake. At night, the fire crackles. The bodies shift, and the roof groans under the weight of another snowstorm. You lie there, eyes open, heart beating slowly, listening to the sound of communal survival. You share everything here, the warmth, the air, the diseases, and the guilt. Secrets are whispered behind hands but heard by all. Someone is always pregnant, someone else is always dying. Most of the time, it's hard to tell which is which. There are arguments about chores, about who stole which blanket, and about whether or not the sheep is cursed. These arguments never truly end. They just pause when everyone gets tired or cold or both. In summer, the longhouse is a furnace. In winter, it's a crypt with ambitions. Either way, it's where you live, where you train, where you dream of not living here anymore. But you won't leave, because where would you go? Outside, it's worse. Outside, there are more animals, more smoke, and occasionally raiders. At least in here, the smoke is your smoke, and the feet in your face belong to people you recognize. The longhouse is not comfortable. It is not clean. It is not safe, but it is yours, and you will defend it with the same energy you use to defend your bed from that goose. In the dark, you reach out and feel the rough texture of wood, the scratch of straw, the heat of another human body too close for comfort but not close enough for warmth. You turn over, bury your face in the fur of a blanket that once belonged to something with teeth, and try not to think about what's moving underneath it. This is home. It is loud, it is crowded, it is damp, and it smells like a secret no one wants to remember, but it keeps you alive. For now, you wake before the sun, and not out of choice but obligation, and the kind of bone-deep instinct that only develops when your survival depends on not being the last one up. The longhouse does not wake quietly. There is the sound of coughing, of pigs grunting, of someone loudly spitting into a corner, and someone else yelling about it. You rise from your bed of straw, which is more accurately a bed of half-rotted stalks, old lice, and whatever your neighbor's foot dragged in last night. You reach for your boots, which are either wet or missing or full of mice, and prepare for another day that is not dramatically different from the day before, or the day before that, or the entire previous season. There are no weekends. The Viking calendar does not mark days of rest. You train, because if you don't, you fall behind, and falling behind means becoming baggage in a culture that drags no one. Your morning meal is hard, sometimes edible, sometimes questionable. You chew through smoked fish that looks like it lost a fight with both the ocean and the fire pit. There is ale if you're lucky, water if you're desperate, and nothing at all if someone forgot to boil it last night. After that, you train, not for glory, not for applause. You train because life is a war you have to audition for daily. Your training begins with running. You run laps through mud, over uneven stones, around livestock, dodging children, and sometimes dodging the old man who swings a stick if you get too close to his goose. The goose is aggressive. It is also your unofficial coach. Next comes shield work. You hold a round wooden slab, heavier than your confidence, and brace for impact as another trainee slams into it with a dull axe. You block. You counter. You slip. You fall. You bleed. Sometimes you cry. Mostly, you don't have time. You rotate through weapons. Axe, spear, sword, bow, club. You are not expected to master them. You are expected to be dangerous enough with each one that no one volunteers to test your competence. Your body begins to ache before the midday meal, which is a stew with ingredients that inspire philosophical questions about what qualifies as food. You eat standing. There is no pause. The concept of taking a break does not exist. After eating, you resume. Sparring matches are sometimes instructional, sometimes personal. You are hit. You hit back. You are praised for bleeding well. You do not win by being fast or strong. You win by refusing to stop. Fatigue becomes a form of communication. Everyone knows you are tired. That's not an excuse. It's a shared understanding. You carry stones uphill to train your grip strength. You climb ropes with splinters. You drag logs in the snow. You learn to fall without breaking something important. You get used to the sound of your breath echoing through your helmet and the taste of metal when your teeth chip during a fall. You treat injuries with spit, dirt, and curses. If you twist an ankle, you limp louder. If you break a finger, you bandage it to a sturdier one and apologize to your sword. By evening, you've lost count of the bruises. You sit by the fire and rub oil on your arms that someone told you was medicinal but smells like spoiled goat fat. You replay every mistake in your head, knowing someone else remembered it too. You promise to do better tomorrow, or at least to duck faster, and then you're told to help repair shields, or fix a fence, or clean the weapons. Training does not stop when the sword is down. It just becomes a different kind of labor. You sharpen blades with fingers that barely feel anymore. You stack hay bales. You stir the dye pots for the tunics. You don't complain. Complaints are expensive. They cost you respect. And in a place where every scar is proof of loyalty, being seen as soft is worse than being wounded. At night, you lie down in the same position you fought in, curled, braced, aching. You dream of nothing. Your body is too tired for dreams. And as the wind howls outside the walls, you grip your blanket and tell yourself this is the life you chose, even if it's more accurate to say it chose you first. Food in your Viking life is not sustenance. It is challenge. You are not dining. You are negotiating with fire, luck, and biology. Meals are not served. They are endured. Each one is an exercise in doubt. You never really know what's in the pot, only that it's warm and no longer moving. That is enough. Breakfast, if it exists, is a formality, a transitional ritual between sleep and violence. A crust of rye bread that survived the night, half burned from last night's hearth, topped with whatever animal fat is still semi-solid in the morning chill. It tastes like charcoal and memory. If there's porridge, it's cold, thick, and carries the texture of wet gravel. You eat with your hands, unless your hands are already occupied holding down the bowl from a sibling, trying to share what you both know is a one-person portion. There are no forks. Knives are for everything. Cutting meat, threats, and occasionally negotiation. Lunchtime, if you can call it that, is stew. Always stew. Perpetual, bubbling mystery stew. It started as venison 4 days ago, but it has since absorbed dried peas, boiled grains, mouldy cabbage, 3 turnips, and something someone swears was once an eel. The pot is never emptied. It's only ever added to, scraped from, then returned to the fire, like a swamp, slowly boiling itself into a meal. Meat is not expected. It is celebrated. If you taste meat, you've either had a good day or something has died nearby. Fresh meat means death. Something fell. A sheep, a bird, a traveler. You will not ask questions. You will just eat. Boiling is preferred because it kills what must die. Burnt food is safety. Char is a blessing. It means heat, and heat is your best ally. Raw meat, on the other hand, may still be plotting against you. It carries risks, worms, sickness, spirits, according to your uncle, who once blamed undercooked fish for his nightmares. The truth is that eating raw flesh is not a choice. It is a failure of preparation. But some nights, there is no fire, only cold, damp strips of flesh and hope. Fish is a dietary constant. Rivers, seas, lakes. If it swims, it's on the menu. Dried fish, salted fish, smoked fish, rotten fish, pressed into cakes and covered in lard. Bones are optional, heads are not. They stare at you while you chew their cousins. Shellfish is eaten when times are desperate, which is always. You boil the clams and hope they open. If not, you break them open and pretend they were meant to resist. Milk is consumed warm, direct from the goat, frothy and suspicious. It's both beverage and gamble. Cheese is a byproduct of forgetting about milk until it solidifies out of stubbornness. Some are edible, some require prayer. You eat both. Butter is churned with wooden paddles by angry hands. It smells slightly of sour. You smear it on bark and call it breakfast. Ale is consumed at every meal, not because you enjoy it, but because the water may contain your ancestors. Wells are shallow. Streams are polluted by livestock. Rainwater is a luxury, and only safe if strained through a cloth you pray was clean. Thirst is often ignored. You get used to it. Your stomach adapts to abuse. Children are fed less and cry more. Elders eat first out of respect, but quietly, so as not to invite envy. On feast days, food arrives in quantities too large for comprehension. You eat quickly, ravenously, until your body rebels. You vomit. You sleep. You wake up hungry. Gluttony is not a sin. It is a seasonal necessity. Fasting is common, but never religious. It's enforced by circumstance, by drought, by supply chains that rely on weather and luck, and boats that may not return. Winter is the true test. Root vegetables become legends. You dream of onions. You praise a carrot like a god. You bury turnips so they last. And when they don't, you lie about it. Hunger becomes a shared language. You speak it with your eyes, with your silence, with the way you scrape the pot long after the food is gone. Cutlery is scarce. You share bowls. You eat from troughs. You watch for thieves and pretend they're family. There are no desserts, only berries and lies. Occasionally honey, which is hoarded, traded, and worshipped. If someone offers you honey, they either love you or are about to poison you. And you'll eat it anyway, because even poisoned sweetness is still sweet. Food is everything. It's power. It's politics. It's a reason to raid, to trade, to kill, to marry. The best warriors get the best cuts. The strongest mothers get the last loaf. The weakest pretend they're not hungry. You eat in silence. You eat in noise. You eat standing, squatting, kneeling, never seated. Seated implies luxury. You do not eat for pleasure. You eat for tomorrow. And if you wake up hungry again, that is the best sign that yesterday's meal did its job. Cleanliness, in your Viking world, is less a daily practice and more a seasonal miracle. The concept of hygiene exists, technically, but it does not resemble anything modern minds might recognize. You do not bathe every day. You do not brush your teeth. You do not wash your hands before eating because there is no such thing as a clean hand, only one that is less dirty. You share water with livestock, tools, and relatives. Soap is a luxury made from ash and fat, and smells exactly like you'd expect. Burnt lard, with a hint of disappointment. Washing clothes is rare. Clothes are beaten on rocks, scrubbed in freezing water, and dried by wind, sun, or fire, whichever arrives first. Most garments are only cleaned when they are either too stiff to wear or too odorous to ignore. Stains are not removed. They are redefined as decoration or character. Lice are inevitable. They live in your hair, your clothes, your bedding, your eyebrows, and possibly your soul. You do not defeat lice. You coexist. You learn to live with the constant itch, the gentle scurrying of things alive where things should not be. Occasionally, someone burns their tunic, just to make a point. Fleas are social creatures. They spread from person to person, house to house, animal to human, and back again. You scratch. You curse. You boil your cloak in a desperate act of warfare, and by morning the fleas are back, sipping revenge from your ankles. Bathing is a group activity, if it happens at all. Once a week, maybe once a month, you might heat a tub of water. You will share it with family members, in order of importance. The elder goes first, the child goes last, and the water goes from cloudy to tragic. Public bathhouses exist in some towns, but so do diseases. You pay your coin, strip down in front of strangers, sit in hot water filled with other people's bacteria, and pretend it's relaxing. If you're rural, your bath is a cold stream. You dip in, you scream, you get out. There is no soap. You rub yourself with moss or sand and pretend you feel cleaner. Hair is rarely washed. Oil and smoke keep it matted down into something manageable. Combs are carved from bone and used more for decoration than hygiene. Facial hair is optional, but lice don't care about fashion. You do not shave unless there is a ritual or punishment involved. Teeth are cleaned with twigs, maybe. More often they are ignored until they fall out, rot, or ache, so badly that someone decides the solution is a hot knife and a stronger drink. Dentistry does not exist. If you get an abscess, you either die or become a cautionary tale. Fingernails are short because you use them to claw dirt, grip weapons, and snap sinew. Toenails are long, cracked, forgotten. They live inside shoes made of hide, soaked in sweat, and shared between siblings. Shoes are never clean. They are repositories for mud, blood, and things you cannot identify. Your feet always smell. Everyone's feet smell. It is not rude to mention it. It is rude to act surprised. Odor is part of life. Your breath smells like the inside of a goat's stomach. Your armpits smell like last year's campfire. Your clothes smell like your home, which smells like smoke, mildew, salted fish, and humans who have not bathed in recent memory. But this does not make you dirty. It makes you normal. Clean people are either rich, sick, or dead. Corpses are washed before burial. That is the cleanest you will ever be. Women are expected to maintain some level of grooming. They wash their hair more often. They smell slightly better, but not enough to matter. Men don't notice. Neither does the livestock. Children are usually filthy. Dirt is a second skin. You stop cleaning them after a certain age because the dirt protects them from worse things, like biting insects or judgment. Hygiene practices are taught by example, and the example is usually someone scratching their neck with a bone knife while stirring stew. You pass that tradition down proudly. Illness spreads through the community because no one washes hands, sneezes into sleeves, or boils their linen. Germ theory does not exist. You blame spirits, curses, or foreigners. When a fever arrives, you do not disinfect the house. You burn herbs and hope. Disease is a mystery. Cleanliness is superstition. You believe certain types of water cleanse sin. You believe certain soaps protect against evil. You believe that bathing too often makes you weak, or worse, vain. Vanity is punished. Dirt is humble. Blood is honest. Cleanliness is unnatural unless it is ceremonial. The closest thing to routine hygiene is sweating. You sweat every day. You rinse in rain. You soak in snowmelt. You steam in summer. You dry out by firelight. And you repeat. Your smell is part of your identity. Warriors carry their stench into battle like a weapon. A clean man is a suspicious man. The only time a Viking smells pleasant is after death, after ritual washing, after the body has been prepared with herbs and oils to make it presentable to the gods, or at least tolerable to the mourners. You will not live to see modernity. You will not learn about bacteria. You will die never knowing the word hygiene. You will be buried in a tunic that has never been washed, surrounded by mourners who have never brushed their teeth, under a sky that has never known the scent of lavender. And none of it will seem strange to you, because you lived in a time when staying alive mattered more than staying clean, and when the only real bath was the sea, and the only real soap was fire. Religion in Viking life is not a quiet Sunday affair, reserved for polite conversation or whispered prayers over tea. It is a drumbeat in your ears, a force in your bones, a public ritual, a private panic, a way to make sense of weather, war, childbirth, boils, livestock death, love, and toothaches. The gods are not subtle, they are not gentle, they are not distant, they are loud, emotional, and always watching. Odin sees you when you are sleeping, he sees you when you are awake, he sees you when you lie, when you bleed, when you kill, and when you eat an extra portion of stew. He is both the All-Father and the all-surveillance system. Thor, god of thunder, is not merely a myth. He is the reason you blame bad harvests on sky noises. When lightning strikes a tree, you say Thor sneezed. When your cow dies in the night, you say Thor is angry. When your sword shatters in combat, you scream his name and hope he notices you screaming. Religion explains everything and excuses nothing. If something happens, the gods did it. If nothing happens, the gods are testing you. Every event is a message. Every misfortune is a lesson. Every blessing is bait. Your day begins with ritual. You wake, you breathe, you thank the gods, you stretch, you thank the gods, you go outside, you trip on a chicken, you thank the gods for the warning, you cut your hand on a rusted blade, you thank the gods for reminding you of mortality, you feed the fire, you pray it does not go out. Fire is sacred, smoke is sacred, ashes are sacred. You blow on coals and imagine your ancestors watching. Shrines are not optional. Even if you are poor, you maintain a small altar in your home. A few carved tokens, a bit of blood, a lock of hair, an offering of bread, or the last piece of meat you really didn't want to give up. Sacrifice is expected. Blood is payment. If you want something from the gods, you must bleed. Yourself, your animal, your neighbor, the gods aren't picky. Larger sacrifices are communal and terrifying. The goddy, your local priest, if that's the right word, leads the ceremonies. He wears furs, antlers, sometimes blood. He doesn't speak so much as chant. The crowd joins in. You don't understand the words, but you repeat them anyway. It's tradition. It's safety. It's insurance. At the thing, the Viking assembly, law is decided under the eyes of the gods. Oaths are sworn on holy rings. Breaking one means death, not by law, but by lightning, plague, or mysterious accidents involving axes. Religion is not comfort, it is obligation. The gods are not benevolent. They are powerful. You respect them, not because they are good, but because they are dangerous, like wolves, or the sea. Temples are rare, but sacred spaces are not. A grove of trees, a hilltop, a rock shaped vaguely like a face. All are holy, if enough people say so. You don't go to church. You go to the woods and bleed on a stump. You go to a cairn and whisper your secrets into the wind. You carve runes into stones and hope someone, or something, is reading. Runes themselves are magical. Writing is not mundane. It is not for shopping lists. It is for protection, for curses, for sending messages to the unseen. You carve them into swords, doors, bones, and your skin. Religion bleeds into every decision. Want to travel? Better check with the gods. Want to marry? Better offer something first. Want to go to war? You already know what the gods want. More war. There is no atheism. The concept does not exist. Doubt is a death sentence, not because others will kill you, but because the gods will notice you hesitating and adjust your luck accordingly. Luck itself is divine. Some have more than others, and you know why. The gods play favorites. If you succeed, you were chosen. If you fail, you were found lacking. The afterlife is not a single destination. It is a branching path, determined by how you lived and how you died. Die with a weapon in hand? Valhalla. Die without it? Hell, spelled with one L, where nothing happens and everything is cold. There are other realms, but no one agrees on them. Some believe in reincarnation. Some believe in ghost dogs. Everyone agrees on one thing. Death is not the end. Your ancestors are listening. Your children will join you someday. Your bones must be treated with respect, or the consequences will be spiritual and immediate. Burial practices vary. Cremation is common, especially for warriors. You burn the body, scatter the ashes, and pray the smoke carries their soul. Others are buried with possessions, swords, beads, combs, livestock, because you never know what the afterlife requires. Funerals are loud. Screaming is encouraged. The dead are spoken to directly. You apologize. You plead. You promise to keep their memory alive and hope they don't come back angry. Ghosts are real. Everyone knows someone who saw one. They are not scary. They are inconvenient. You keep them away with iron, words, or moving house entirely. Religion informs your morality. Killing is fine if it's justified. Lying is fine if it's clever. Generosity is admired, but only if witnessed. Pride is a sin only when it fails. Honor is more important than virtue. Strength is proof of divine favor. Weakness is evidence of divine disappointment. Religion is not silent. It's in the chants, the songs, the drum beats, the howls. It's in the thunder, the waves, the screams during childbirth, the roar of fire, the whistle of arrows. There is no escape. The gods walk among you. They take forms. They test you. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes they marry your cousin. You don't question it. You accept it. You internalize it. You tell stories around the fire. You pass them down. You exaggerate. You simplify. You believe. Not because you choose to, but because there is no alternative. Religion is not separate from life. It is life. It is the invisible frame that holds every part of your existence together, loosely, loudly, and always with blood. Clothing in your Viking life is not about fashion. It is about survival. It is about putting things between your soft, easily broken body and the things that want to kill it, which is mostly the weather. You do not own a closet. You do not own a dresser. You have a single chest, a couple hooks, and whatever space is left between the smoke-blackened rafters and the dried fish. You own 2 outfits. If you are rich, you own 3. One is for work. One is for sleeping. The third, if you are lucky or someone else has died recently, is for ceremonies, travel, or impressing judgmental neighbors who think you smell worse than they do. You wear wool, all the time, not because you like it, but because it exists. Wool is everywhere. It is spun, woven, traded, and cursed. Sheep are sacred in the way firewood is sacred. You need them to stay alive, and they ruin everything when they die at the wrong time. Wool itches. It scratches. It absorbs every smell your body produces, and then gives them back to you, like bad memories. Wool is not soft unless it is soaked, scrubbed, and begged. It keeps you warm. It also keeps you miserable. Your base layer is usually a linen undertunic, if you can afford linen. Linen is lighter, smoother, and infinitely rarer. If you are a woman, you wear a long chemise underneath a longer overdress, probably dyed with whatever color the local plants can produce, which is usually brown. If you are a man, you wear a tunic and trousers. Your tunic reaches your thighs or knees. Your trousers are baggy, unless they've shrunk in the rain, in which case you pretend they're supposed to be like that. Belts are essential. Nothing stays up on its own. There are no zippers, no buttons, no elastic waistbands. There are ties, loops, and the sheer force of will. Belts also carry your knife, your pouch, your keys, and your hopes. Layers matter. You don't wear one thing. You wear many things. You layer like you're preparing for a battle against the wind, because you are. Over your base layer comes another tunic, usually thicker, then a cloak, then a fur if you have it, then another cloak if you're feeling dramatic or afraid of death. Cloaks are fastened with brooches, which are status symbols, murder weapons, and emergency sewing kits all in one. Brooches tell people who you are, what you own, and how much it would hurt to rob you. Footwear is made of leather. It is stitched by hand, soaked in oil, and shaped around feet that have never known arch support. Viking shoes are simple. They cover your feet and keep most of the mud out. Sometimes, socks are made of wool. They are thick, mismatched, and always damp. Gloves are rare. Mittens are rarer. You use your sleeves. Hats are made of fur, felt, or repurposed shame. They do not look good. They look warm, and that is enough. Hair is part of the outfit. You braid it, tie it, oil it, and occasionally wash it. Long hair is normal. Clean hair is suspicious. If your hair smells like pine, you are either rich or have recently caught fire. Beards are standard. The longer the beard, the less you need to explain yourself. Jewelry is functional. Rings, beads, and amulets tell stories. They are often charms, protection, or a way to trade favors. Necklaces are not decorative. They are declarations. Women wear brooches to hold up their overdresses. These brooches are sometimes so elaborate they double as armor. You could kill a man with your jewelry, and sometimes that is the point. Children wear smaller versions of adult clothes. There is no such thing as baby Viking fashion. Children are bundled in scraps, cloaks, and leftovers. Their clothing is designed to survive dirt, weather, livestock, and other children. They will outgrow their clothes, and then their siblings will inherit them, stained with experience. In winter, layering becomes an Olympic sport. You wear everything you own. You borrow what you don't. You stuff wool into your boots, wrap fur around your legs, and hope the wind forgets your name. There is no central heating. There is only layering and regret. Your outerwear smells like everything you've ever done in it. You do not wash wool. You air it. Maybe. If the sun is out. If the chickens aren't nesting on it. If you remember. Most of the time, you ignore the smell. You are used to it. It is part of you. Rain is not your friend. Wool absorbs moisture like it's getting paid for it. Once wet, your clothes stay wet for days. You do not own a second set. You hang them by the fire and watch them steam like judgmental ghosts. Dry clothes are a luxury. Dry shoes are a miracle. Snow is worse. It sneaks into every seam, every boot, every gap between tunic and trousers. You try to seal the edges with leather straps, wool bands, or sheer willpower. It works until it doesn't. Then you get frostbite. Then you lose a toe. Then you name your next child after the toe to remember. Summer is no relief. Wool does not go away. You wear lighter wool, shorter wool, or linen if the gods smile on you. You sweat through every layer. You pray for breeze. You do not remove clothing. That invites insects, sunburn, and scandal. Nakedness is reserved for bathing, punishment, or madness. Fashion is social armor. You wear what your role demands. Warriors dress for intimidation. Traders dress for wealth. Farmers dress for mud. Everyone dresses for survival. Colors mean something. Bright colors require expensive dyes. Blue from woad, red from madder, yellow from weld. If you wear green, it's because your wife boiled nettles for 3 days and prayed for results. Most people wear brown, grey, or something that used to be white. Embroidery exists. It is art, magic, and memory. Women stitch patterns into hems that tell stories no one else sees. Men pretend not to notice, then tell those stories at feasts. Tailoring is crude, but effective. You cut cloth to fit, sew it by hand, and pray it doesn't unravel in public. If it does, you make a joke, then make a new friend, then trade for better thread. Stitches are crooked, seams are thick, nothing fits perfectly, everything fits well enough. Armor is clothing too. If you are lucky, you own a mail shirt. If you are luckier, you inherited one. Mail is heavy, noisy, and smells like rust, blood, and the guy who wore it before you. Underneath, you wear padding, a gambeson, which is essentially a quilt designed to absorb pain and spread sweat evenly across your torso. Helmets are iron, leather, or your head. No horns, never horns. That's a myth spread by people who wanted you to look ridiculous. You wear fur, you wear leather, you wear bark, if necessary. You wear what works, you wear what doesn't fall apart. You wear what keeps you from dying. Tailors are respected, feared, and underpaid. Spinners are saints. Weavers are magicians. Everyone else just tries not to freeze. Clothing is not fashion. It is armor, identity, and suffering stitched into shape. You do not wear what you love. You love what you wear because it is still intact after 3 winters and hasn't been eaten by goats. Every stitch is a decision. Every hole is a memory. Every patch is a lesson. Your clothes know more about your life than your friends do. They have been with you through rain, war, childbirth, festivals, funerals, and days where you ate nothing but boiled bark and anger. They do not forget. They do not forgive. They stretch. They stink. They survive. Like you. Love in Viking society was less about romance and more about property, survival, and securing alliances between families through strategic arrangements. Marriage was not the culmination of love. It was the start of a legal partnership, often negotiated with more care than peace treaties and usually sealed with livestock. You didn't marry the person who gave you butterflies. You married the one whose father offered the most goats. The concept of marrying for love would have been charming if it weren't considered reckless. Your feelings were not consulted. Your lineage, fertility, and family land were. Lust, meanwhile, was acknowledged. It happened. People were human. But it was not celebrated. It was tolerated, managed, and occasionally punished if it got in the way of alliances. A Viking courtship was not built on flowers and long walks. It was built on negotiations between fathers, verbal contracts, and dowries that included ale, wool, and the occasional weapon. Women had more agency than most medieval cultures, which is not saying much. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and sometimes even decline a marriage. But decline too many times, and you were labeled difficult, and difficult women were traded like spoiled meat, useful only in desperation. The ideal bride was fertile, obedient, and well-connected. The ideal groom was not dead. Engagements were often arranged when the bride was still a child, and consummated when she was just old enough to walk steadily to the altar. The groom might be older, richer, and already married, but those were details, not deterrents. Polygamy was not common, but it wasn't forbidden. It just required resources, patience, and a high pain threshold. Weddings were not about dresses. No one wore white. They wore what they had, which was usually wool. The bride wore her hair down if she was a virgin, up if she wasn't, and under a veil if everyone had given up guessing. The groom might wear his finest tunic, which looked exactly like his worst tunic, only less patched. The ceremony involved feasting, drinking, toasting, more drinking, and a public declaration of union. Rings were not common, promises were, and so was the expectation of loyalty. Cheating was frowned upon, unless it was done discreetly and profitably. Infidelity could lead to shame, exile, or a polite stabbing, depending on your social rank and who you offended. Divorce was possible. A woman could leave her husband by declaring her intention in front of witnesses and walking away from the home. Simple, but not without risk. She would need support, and in Viking society, support came with strings attached. Children were assets. They ensured legacy, secured land, and tied families together in legally binding knots that could survive war, famine, and the occasional blood feud. Women who bore many children were respected. Women who didn't were suspected. The notion of infertility was not medical.it was mystical. If you couldn't conceive, it was the gods punishing your family or a neighbor's curse. Remedies included herbs, rituals, prayers, and, occasionally, swapping partners for one that wasn't cursed. Romantic love did exist, but it was private, risky, and preferably written into sagas long after everyone involved was dead. If you loved your spouse, that was fine. If you didn't, that was also fine, as long as you managed the household and bore healthy heirs. Men sought wives who could manage a farm, bear sons, and not die during childbirth. Women sought husbands who could protect the farm, feed the sons, and not die in a raid. Low bar, reasonable expectations. Flirting involved offers of ale, mild insults, and occasionally wrestling. If a man stole a woman's comb or commented on her loom work, it might mean love, or a challenge. It was hard to tell. Courtship gifts included beads, amber, silver, or an entire pig. Flowers wilted, jewelry lasted. And meat was always impressive. If a woman accepted a gift, it meant interest. If she kept it, it meant a dowry was incoming. If she returned it, it meant someone was about to fight. Love poems existed, but they were written by bards who hadn't been married. The sagas told of tragic lovers, star-crossed fates, and noble sacrifices. Reality told of mismatched expectations, long winters, and arguments over whose turn it was to patch the roof. Fidelity was encouraged, but not universal. Viking men who traveled often had lovers abroad. Viking women, when lonely, made friends with visiting traders, neighbors, or the blacksmith with nice arms. If discovered, consequences varied from none to very severe. It depended on who was humiliated and how loudly. Strategic marriages maintained peace. If your neighbor raided your sheep last year, marrying his daughter might ensure he raided someone else's this year. Politics and family merged. Your wedding was your family's foreign policy. Elders, not lovers, planned your future. And once sealed, breaking the agreement meant more than heartbreak. It meant legal action, financial restitution, and possibly bloodshed. Marriage was a legal contract, reinforced by oaths, family reputation, and community pressure. There was no honeymoon. There was a shared bed, a shared blanket, and shared chores. Affection grew slowly, through routine, survival, and the absence of betrayal. Or it didn't, and everyone pretended otherwise. A happy marriage was quiet, productive, and invisible. A dramatic marriage was loud, memorable, and dangerous. Couples lived together, worked together, and raised livestock together. Success was measured by how many winters you endured, and how many sons you trained not to die too young. Widows could remarry. Widowers usually did. There was no time for grief. There was only time to plant, harvest, and avoid dying alone in the snow. Love was optional. Marriage was not. Viking society valued union over emotion, partnership over passion, and the durability of wool over the delicacy of flowers. If you wanted warmth, you lit a fire. If you wanted security, you found a spouse. If you wanted love, you kept it to yourself and prayed it didn't ruin the alliance. Because in the end, the measure of a successful marriage was not the heartbeat. It was the herd count. The Viking sea voyage was not for the faint-hearted or the sensible. It was a wet, splinter-ridden exercise in forced optimism wrapped in wool and hopelessness. Boarding a longship meant embracing every form of discomfort nature had invented, and then multiplying it with teamwork. You did not ride in comfort. You sat shoulder to shoulder with other human beings who had eaten questionable dried fish, sweated through last season's fur, and now refused to acknowledge the collective odor they produced. The longship was narrow, shallow, and stunningly efficient at transferring every wave directly into your spine. It was built for speed and beach landings, not for comfort or peace of mind. There were no seats, only benches. There were no cabins, only the open sky and occasional seagull judgment. There was no privacy, unless you counted the vague curtain of despair that separated each man from his own dignity. The sea was not your friend. It was not majestic or calming. It was a grey, heaving mass of contempt that tried to throw you back to the gods with every swell. Seasickness was not an ailment. It was a rite of passage, a shared humiliation endured in silence while your insides reorganized themselves out your mouth. If you were lucky, you vomited into the sea. If you weren't, you added to the already slick floorboards and hoped the others were too polite to blame you aloud. Navigation was done by sunstones, stars, and unspoken panic. You might aim for Ireland and land in Scotland. You might aim for England and end up with a sword in your leg. It was all part of the plan. The wind was your engine, the oars were your punishment, and the sail was a thin lie you told yourself when your arms gave out. When the wind failed, rowing began, and rowing never ended. Everyone rowed, except the important men. They gave orders, pointed dramatically, and occasionally muttered prayers. You, meanwhile, bled into the oar handle and pretended it didn't hurt. Meals on the sea were practical and uninspired. Dried fish, hard bread, rancid butter, sometimes ale, if the cask hadn't leaked. There was no kitchen, only a shared bag of regrets passed around as sustenance. Bathroom facilities were wherever you weren't standing. You learned to aim downwind and apologize in advance. Sleep was theoretical. If you slept, you did it hunched forward or awkwardly draped over an oar like a forgotten puppet. The cold didn't sleep either. It bit, crept, and nested in your clothes. Your toes vanished first. Your fingers followed. You didn't ask where they went. The only warmth came from proximity, which meant lying beside someone else, ideally someone you didn't hate too much. Conversation was limited. The roar of the sea made intimacy difficult. Yelling was the dominant form of affection. Communication was basic. Pull harder, hold tighter, and scream when you see land or certain death. Storms were common. They arrived without warning and left without apology. The sky turned black. The sea turned wild, and you clung to the ship like a barnacle in denial. If the ship capsized, you had two options: drown quickly or drown slowly. Life vests did not exist. Hope was buoyant, but statistically unreliable. If lightning struck, you prayed it hit the man next to you, ideally someone already unpopular. The existential part crept in around day 3. Once the vomiting stopped, once the rowing rhythm numbed your arms, you began to wonder why you existed, why you were born into this frozen, salt-sprayed nightmare. What god you had angered to be given this destiny, whether you were, in fact, already dead. These thoughts were interrupted only by more rowing, a cramp, or someone nearby dying quietly and falling overboard. That was common. Death came fast and uneventfully. No dramatic farewells. Just a slump, a splash, and a moment of silence if anyone noticed. You hoped you wouldn't be next. But also, if you were, at least it would be warm. Arrival was not triumph. Landfall meant more rowing, a freezing wade to shore, and then combat, labor, or negotiations conducted, while still soaked and shivering. You did not arrive, rested. You arrived, resentful, and cold. Always cold. The ocean taught humility. It stripped you of ego, plans, and occasionally your clothing. If your cloak blew off mid-voyage, it was gone. No one helped. Cloaks were valuable. They'd mourn your loss, not the garment. Helmets were tied on tight, weapons kept dry if possible, and morale was a joke no one remembered how to tell. Leadership meant barking orders, blaming the weather, and praying louder than anyone else. If your leader cried, no one mentioned it. Tears were allowed, if they evaporated before someone saw them. Songs were sung, not joyfully, not well, but rhythm mattered. Chants kept time. 100 men pulling in grim harmony, muttering sagas through cracked lips. These weren't songs of hope. They were reminders that everyone was suffering equally, which, somehow, helped. The boat itself groaned. Wood swelled and cracked. Nails rusted. Ropes frayed. Everything moved, even the things that weren't supposed to. You developed a relationship with the ship. Love, hate, fear, mostly fear. If it failed, so did you. Repairs were made at sea with whatever was available. More wood, leather strips, or sheer willpower. You became very religious. Not out of faith, but out of desperation. Every splash became a whisper of the gods. Every wave a test of worthiness. You promised to build temples, sacrifice goats, name your child after Thor. Anything, if only you reached shore alive. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the gods were busy. And sometimes they just wanted to see what you'd promised next. The camaraderie was brutal. You bonded through exhaustion, hunger, and mutual hallucination. Friendships formed in grunts, eye contact, and shared aches. Enemies were ignored. There was no strength to argue. Petty rivalries drowned in shared misery. The sea didn't care about your grudges. It cared only about balance, wind, and making you feel insignificant, which you were. Profoundly so. At sea, you were a speck in motion, propelled by muscle, fear, and the vague idea of home. When you did reach home, you kissed the mud, you drank whatever wasn't moving, and then, inevitably, someone asked when you were leaving again, and you said soon, because this was life. A cycle of leaving, surviving, and wondering what on earth you were doing. You became good at not dying, not at sailing, not at comfort, just at not dying. That was enough. No one remembered the smooth journeys. They remembered the storms, the losses, and the time Halfdan got hit in the face with a flying cod. That was the stuff of legend. Not glory, but survival. And in Viking lore, those were sometimes the same thing. Battle in Viking life was not sport. It was sustenance, a grim and muddy ballet where death was the prize, and survival merely meant you'd have to do it again next spring. You did not charge into combat for honor. You charged in because your village needed food, your chief needed status, and your cousin already borrowed your axe and died with it. Training for battle consisted of lifting heavy things, screaming into the wind, and hoping you didn't drop your sword in the mud when it mattered. The shield wall was the primary strategy, which sounds organized until you realize it involved pressing yourself against sweaty men, holding a wooden disc, and waiting for someone to try and murder you over it. There were no helmets with horns, only helmets with dents. Horned helmets were a theatrical lie invented centuries later by costume designers and people who wanted Vikings to seem more whimsical than they were. Real Viking helmets were iron, heavy, expensive, and passed down like family curses. If you didn't have one, you hoped your opponent had bad aim. Armor was rare, usually chainmail or leather, unless you were poor, in which case your armor was optimism and a thick tunic. Weapons were extensions of the soul, assuming your soul was rusted, chipped, and stained with someone else's blood. The sword was prestigious, the axe was common, the spear was practical, and the knife was personal. Every weapon had a name. So did every wound. You didn't just get stabbed. You earned a gut spiller or a lung kisser. Naming things made the pain easier to talk about and harder to ignore. Battles did not begin with trumpet blasts. They began with shouting, sweating, and a collective realization that this might be your last morning seeing anything besides someone else's armpit. The ground was rarely flat, the weather never fair, and the gods conspicuously absent. You fought barefoot, half blind from smoke, and usually dehydrated. Your enemies looked like you, smelled like you, and often were your distant relatives or former trade partners. War was seasonal, practical, and repetitive. Raids were timed with the harvest, so you could pillage in the fall, boast in the winter, and prepare for retaliation in the spring. Battles ended when one side stopped moving or surrendered, preferably before lunch. There were no medics. If you were injured, you were either dead or about to be. Healing involved herbal guesses, biting on leather, and hoping your body hated infection as much as you did. You never got used to the sound of someone dying. It was personal, loud, and often included screaming names that no one would remember. Shields splintered, bones broke, and time slowed to a crawl you couldn't escape. You smelled blood before you saw it. Iron, sweat, mud, and fear. A perfume worn by everyone who'd survived more than 2 fights. Victory was not celebrated. It was endured. You stood over corpses, wiped your blade on your tunic, and prayed your village still existed. If it did, congratulations. If not, you wandered until someone claimed you or killed you. Looting was expected. If you lived, you took what you could. Jewelry, tools, sometimes people. Morality was flexible. Honor was a luxury. The Shieldmaiden bled like the rest. Women who fought did so with the same desperation and fewer accolades. They were fierce, brutal, and constantly underestimated. No one wrote them songs. They didn't care. They wrote their names in scars. Combat was noisy. Not the theatrical clang of swords, but the thud of bodies, the crack of bones, the wet cough of a punctured lung. You couldn't hear strategy. You could barely hear yourself. Orders were shouted, ignored, repeated, then forgotten. Most battles were chaos in motion, fueled by adrenaline and ancient grudges. You prayed to gods you only half believed in, made promises you wouldn't keep, and swung your weapon until your arms failed, or your enemy did. Retreat wasn't cowardice. It was survival. Tactical withdrawal meant you lived to fight another equally miserable day. Cowards died slower. They were hunted, mocked, and occasionally used for target practice. Better to die screaming than begging. That was the wisdom passed down from elders who had, miraculously, not died yet. If you killed someone important, you were a hero. If they killed you, they were. There were no neutral outcomes. Only stories rewritten by the survivors. Injuries lingered. Scars itched in the cold. Missing fingers made chores complicated. And brain injuries were invisible but abundant. Men returned home changed. Quieter, angrier, sleep disturbed by dreams of the friend they accidentally trampled while fleeing a burning boat. Children played at war, swinging sticks, pretending to be fathers they didn't know had screamed before they fell. Songs were written. They exaggerated everything. No one sang about the time you slipped in blood and cracked your head on a shield. They sang about dragons and valor. You laughed bitterly and limped off to sharpen your axe. There were no medals, no pensions. If you were lucky, someone remembered your name. If you were unlucky, someone remembered your debts. Feasting followed victories. Meat was roasted. Ale flowed. Stories were told. Women rolled their eyes. The dead were toasted, buried if possible, forgotten if not. A man's worth was measured in how many people chanted his saga, or how much gold he left behind. But the dead didn't care. Only the living needed comfort, and the living never rested long. Battles came again. The enemy changed, but the mud stayed the same. The blood dried, but the fear soaked deep. War was not a moment. It was a cycle, and you were just another wheel in motion. One day, someone might tell your story. They'd call you brave. They'd call you strong. They'd forget you cried. Returning home wasn't peace. It was maintenance, of reputation, of livestock, of relationships frayed by distance and burned bread. You didn't come back to silence and comfort. You came back to roofs that leaked, children that grew without your permission, and relatives who now thought they knew better than you. The longhouse hadn't gotten any bigger. If anything, it had shrunk under the pressure of everyone's accumulated secrets, smells, and seasonal disagreements. You weren't greeted with open arms. You were met with expectations. The fence is broken. The goat escaped. Your wife had to do everything while you were off pretending to be important. You were given food. Yes, but mostly to get you strong enough to fix things. The hearth fire wasn't warm. It was smoky. Your bed wasn't soft. It was damp. The straw poked you like accusations. Even the dog acted like you'd been cheating on it. The chieftain expected a full report. What did you win? Who did you kill? Did anyone important notice you? And what did you bring back that wasn't lice? You told your story 3 times. Once to the elders, once to the curious youth, and once to a woman who didn't blink and already knew you were exaggerating. There were no medals. Only nods of approval from people too old to fight and too stubborn to die. Your status in the community now depended on how many scars you could show without taking off your pants. If you returned with gold, people liked you. If you returned with stories, they tolerated you. If you returned with nothing, they gave you chores. Repairing a house with one good arm while pretending the other still worked was considered admirable. It was also mandatory. You fixed the roof with twine, faith, and mild profanity. You patched the wall with mud and straw. You promised to replace the door before next winter, knowing full well you'd forget. Tools were borrowed, never returned, and mysteriously broken. You argued with neighbors over property lines that no one had ever actually agreed on. Boundaries were fluid, so were tempers. Politics in the village wasn't about laws, it was about grudges. Who married whom, who borrowed whose ox, and who forgot to share the last smoked fish. Every conversation had layers. You weren't just talking about weather, you were accusing someone's grandfather of laziness through metaphor. Feasts were held, but not for you. They were for marriages, births, or successful hunts. You attended out of obligation, not joy. You sat on a log that gave you splinters, drank ale that made your tongue dry, and smiled at jokes you'd heard since childhood. If you were lucky, someone passed you a piece of meat. If you weren't, you got a bone and a lecture. Music played, a drum, a flute, someone shouting rhythmically while everyone else clapped off beat. You tried not to look too unimpressed. Elders watched for signs of arrogance. You danced badly and hoped that counted as humility. Courtship was political warfare. Every compliment was an investment. Every touch a negotiation. You weren't marrying for love. You were marrying for land, alliances, and someone to yell at during storms. If you already had a spouse, congratulations. You now had to pretend monogamy was always your plan. Children watched everything. They mimicked your limp. They asked about the scars. You told them heroic lies and then made them chop wood. Discipline was love. Affection was occasional. Praise was rare and usually sarcastic. Domestic peace was an illusion maintained through mutual fatigue. Everyone was tired of each other, of chores, of pretending that things were normal. Arguments happened quietly, in short phrases, through clenched teeth. Loud fights were for outsiders. Real tension simmered like stew, always on the fire, never fully stirred. Your in-laws lived nearby, possibly inside your house. They had opinions. You ignored most of them, but not all, because they also had spare wool and your kids' attention. Spiritual obligations resurfaced. You visited the local god pole, muttered the usual thanks, and avoided making eye contact with the seer who never blinked. You offered sacrifices .breed, blood, or whatever animal looked at you the wrong way. You said you were thankful. You didn't say for what. You assumed the gods already knew, or didn't care. Winter preparations began before summer ended. You chopped wood, like your survival depended on it, because it did. You stored dried fish, salted meat, regret. The cold would come, and with it, the reminder that firewood wasn't just comfort.it was currency. Your marriage, if it had survived your absence, was now tested by routine. Snoring, shared chores, disagreements about whether the thatch needed patching again. Intimacy was scheduled around exhaustion. Romance was implied. Children multiplied. You never questioned their parentage. Publicly, privately, you counted on your fingers and hoped. Gossip flowed faster than the river. You were in it. Everyone was. Reputation was built slowly and destroyed in a single poorly timed sneeze. You laughed at the wrong joke? Arrogant. You brought home a broken sword? Weak. You looked too happy? Suspicious. So you practiced looking tired, humble, and vaguely regretful. It was the safest mask. Farming resumed. You planted barley, harvested disappointment. You bartered for things you used to steal. Peace was exhausting. Every calm moment was just time borrowed from the next chaos. You were always alert. For raiders, famine, illness, and awkward dinner conversations. If your friend's ox died, you offered sympathy and hoped he didn't ask for yours. Community was vital. Community was suffocating. The same people every day, in the same clothes, with the same grudges. You considered leaving again. The sea was awful, but at least it didn't talk back. Home was many things. Familiar, necessary, loud. It was safety and suffocation in equal parts. You didn't love it, but you needed it. Because outside of it, there was nothing but wolves, wind, and people who hadn't forgiven you yet. Raising children in Viking society was less about nurturing and more about survival, responsibility, and ritualized chaos with sharp objects. The goal wasn't to create well-rounded individuals with a healthy sense of self-worth. The goal was to create people who could survive the winter, row a boat, skin a deer, lie convincingly to a chieftain, and accept loss with a shrug. Infants were born into rooms with more smoke than air, wrapped in wool that probably still belonged to a previous sibling who didn't make it. Naming was not immediate. Many infants didn't earn a name until the parents were reasonably sure they wouldn't stop breathing in the middle of the night. And even then, names were functional, not inspirational. You weren't called Starlight or Peace. You were called something like Boarhead or Stoneface, names meant to confuse spirits and inspire fear in neighbors. Childhood wasn't a protected phase of life. It was more like an unpaid internship in pain tolerance and obedience. The village raised you, which meant any adult could tell you what to do, correct your behavior, and occasionally throw a wooden spoon at you for chewing too loudly. Your biological parents were often too busy farming, fighting, or regretting you to manage the full weight of your development. By the age of 4, you were expected to know basic survival skills. By 7, you were holding something sharp and pretending it wasn't heavy. By 10, you were considered old enough to herd goats alone, which in Viking terms was roughly equivalent to being handed a credit card and a battle plan. There was no such thing as a phase. If you were moody, you were sent to pick rocks from a field. If you asked too many questions, you were directed toward the woods and told to find your own answers. Emotional intelligence was measured by how well you suppressed it. Crying was permitted only if accompanied by visible wounds or the death of a relative, and even then, there was a time limit. Play existed, but only in forms that doubled as training. Wrestling, racing, and throwing things at other children were all encouraged, as long as no one lost an eye or embarrassed the family. Toys were carved from bone and wood. They were educational, which meant they could be used as weapons or tools, depending on your creativity and level of supervision. You didn't get holidays. You got special tasks, which meant the same work in a slightly different location. If you asked for a day off, you were told stories of ancestors who died face down in the fjord because they took one afternoon to nap. Education was informal and immediate. You learned by watching, mimicking, and being corrected with a stick. Reading was rare, unless you were destined for the monastery, and even then, it was mostly Latin curses and theological loopholes. Math was counting sheep and arrows. Science was, don't eat the red berries. Children's clothing was utilitarian, scratchy, and likely patched from a relative's old trousers. Shoes were seasonal luxuries. You bathed when your parents remembered, or when the smell began to interfere with communal meals. Cleanliness was associated with weakness. Dirt was your second skin. Illness was common. Cures were inconsistent. You were given herbs, chants, or both, and expected to either improve or stop being a burden. Medical care was delivered by someone who also delivered goats. If you lived, you were considered stronger. If you died, well, the gods clearly wanted a do-over. Parents didn't sugarcoat. They told you that life was hard, death was common, and you'd better get good at lifting things. The best compliment you could receive was being told you didn't make things worse. Rebellion was met with silence, then chores. If you tried to run away, you'd be found by your aunt, who would drag you back by the ear and lecture you with a ladle. Praise was rare. Sarcasm was frequent. A good day was one where you didn't get blamed for anything, and no one bled on the floor. Your milestones were practical. Your first fire, your first kill, Your first lie that fooled an adult. Sentimentality was reserved for funeral songs and lost tools. If you drew on the wall, you were told to draw better. If you carved a toy, you were told to make a dozen and sell them. Childhood ended not with a celebration but with responsibility. The first time you were left in charge of something alive or flammable, you were no longer a child. You were now a smaller, unpaid adult. Girls were expected to spin, cook, heal, and glare. Boys were expected to lift, fight, and pretend they weren't scared of girls. Both were taught to respect the gods, fear strangers, and always know where the sharpest knife was. Romantic education consisted of overheard conversations, awkward metaphors, and a vague sense that love was either a trap or a trade agreement. Mistakes were punished through humiliation, not discussion. If you forgot to bring in the goats, everyone joked about it for weeks. If you tripped in front of the chieftain, you were called knee-face for a year. But you learned, quickly, because not learning meant more chores, more shame, or in extreme cases, more goats. There were no child psychologists. There were elders. If you were lucky, you got advice. If you weren't, you got compared unfavorably to someone else's grandchild. Funerals for children were solemn but efficient. Grief was shown in silence, not words. You moved on because you had to. Because fields needed tilling and pigs needed feeding and life didn't pause just because it was unfair. And in the rare quiet moments, when you stared at the stars or listened to the wind over the hills, you understood that being a child in Viking society wasn't about being protected. It was about being prepared for storms, for swords, for silence, and for the kind of love that looked a lot like labor. In Viking life, death was not an interruption but a companion, ever present and occasionally inconvenient, like an overly familiar relative who shows up uninvited and never asks if now is a good time, because it never was, and that never mattered, because life was not a promise but a loan, paid back in installments of frostbite, infected wounds, childbirth gone sideways, and a well-placed axe when things got personal, which they often did. And while modern narratives like to romanticize the warrior's end, to the slow-motion swing of the sword, the poetic final breath, the truth was that most people died as they lived, surrounded by livestock, mud, poorly treated wooden furniture, and a general sense that this whole experience was never going to make it to Valhalla anyway, because Valhalla required a glorious death, and those were rare, inconvenient, and usually messy. And so the average death looked less like a saga and more like slipping in the snow while carrying firewood and not getting up again, or catching a cold that turned into a cough, that turned into blood, that turned into silence. Or maybe you just didn't wake up one morning and nobody noticed until lunch. Because with a life expectancy that hovered somewhere between barely adult and miraculously elderly, people didn't expect permanence. They expected attrition. And they prepared for death, the way you prepare for rain, with resignation, a few practical steps, and the knowledge that if it comes today, well, so be it. And so you lived under a mental umbrella, constantly aware that everything you did had consequences, and many of those consequences could involve death, or worse, being remembered badly, which in a culture built on oral tradition and reputation, meant that your legacy could be as fragile as the throat you used to shout your last words, assuming anyone was listening, which they probably weren't because someone else had already started looting your boots. And yes, there were rituals. Burials with swords and coins, pyres for the especially important, and quiet mutterings over hastily dug graves behind the pig pen. But most of these were not designed to honor the dead so much as to keep the dead from coming back, because Viking belief in the supernatural was robust, and the last thing anyone wanted was a disgruntled ghost with unresolved issues stomping around the longhouse, knocking things off shelves, souring the milk, or worse, dragging someone else back into the grave with them. And so you burned bodies when you could, buried them with tools for the afterlife, spoke their names in the correct tone, and then moved on, because grief was a luxury and sentimentality was a hazard, and in the time it took to lament properly, Your thatch roof might collapse, your neighbor might steal your fishing net, or your children might eat something they shouldn't and die ironically while you wept for someone already gone. And so emotions were streamlined, practical, efficient, because the dead didn't need your tears, they needed a clean send-off, some small honor if they earned it, and preferably no drama, because drama encouraged the gods to pay attention, and the gods were famously capricious, like drunk landlords with lightning bolts, and so death was treated with wary respect, neither welcomed nor feared, just accepted, like taxes or wolves. And if you did happen to die in battle, if, say, a rival clan remembered an old insult or a local king wanted more land, you might be granted the dubious honor of being mourned in song, though the song would probably exaggerate your heroism and downplay the way you tripped over your own shield, because death was bad for morale and good for propaganda, and the line between legacy and lie was not a line at all. It was a bonfire, and once your body was ash, your story belonged to whoever had the loudest voice at the feast, and that's assuming there was a feast, because sometimes the only thing your death earned was a sigh and a shuffle, and maybe a half-hearted, "He was all right, I guess," before everyone returned to the more urgent task of not being next. And in that way, death was democratic. It came for everyone, indiscriminately, and it asked no questions, gave no warnings, and issued no receipts. And while some might pray to Odin, Freya, or Thor to guide them into the next world, most people understood that what happened after death was someone else's problem, and that your real responsibility was to leave behind as little burden as possible. Clean your tools, settle your debts, don't curse anyone unless you really mean it, and above all, make sure your funeral clothes are dry and intact, because even if your soul goes to another realm, your body is still someone's chore, and no one wants to dig a grave for a naked man in winter, and so you live lightly, you die quickly, and you hope, if nothing else, to be remembered not as the fool who drank bad mead and fell into the latrine, but as someone who faced the end like everything else in Viking life, cold, competent, and vaguely annoyed. Legacy, in the Viking world, was not a sculpture, not a bronze effigy, not a marble bust polished by centuries of admiration, but rather an echo, unreliable, inconsistent, and always louder in hindsight, an echo that originated not in heroic moments but in messy details, shared around smoky hearths by people who might only remember your name because your daughter married into their cousin's fishing line, and even then, you were likely to be called the wrong name by the third retelling, which, by Viking standards, meant you were already halfway to immortality, because what truly mattered wasn't the accuracy of your legacy, but the fact that someone, anyone, still remembered you long enough to misremember you, because memory was power, and power was reputation, and reputation was survival, at least for those who outlived their bodies through story, myth, exaggeration, or scandal. And the truth is, most Viking legacies didn't begin until after death, because while you were alive, people were too busy trying not to die themselves to write your eulogy in real time, and only once your body was cold and inconvenient did your legend begin, mostly because the dead couldn't correct the living, and so your life became available for creative editing, performance embellishment, and long pauses for dramatic effect during feasts where ale flowed and honesty faltered. And if your story had legs, if it carried emotion, irony, or bloodshed, it would be repeated, carried across generations like a slightly rotted torch, flickering and distorted, but still burning with the essence of who you might have been, or who someone decided you were. And in a world where the written word was rare and expensive and mostly wasted on saints and kings, oral tradition did all the heavy lifting, and oral tradition, while powerful, is about as stable as a longship in a hurricane, because it changes with every speaker, every motive, every mood, and so your legacy became a malleable clay sculpture, constantly reshaped by boredom, politics, or the need to impress an audience during long winters. And this meant that the same man could be remembered in one village as a wise elder, who once brokered peace with a neighboring clan, and in another village as the drunk who accidentally married his cousin twice and threw an axe at a goose. And neither version would be right, but both would outlive the truth, which had no allies in the war of remembrance, because truth is quiet and story is loud, and people prefer entertainment over accuracy, especially when those people are cold, tired, and surrounded by the smell of fermented herring. And so if you wanted to be remembered, really remembered, you didn't aim for perfection. You aimed for memorability, which could mean valor, violence, vengeance, or vanity, as long as it made someone raise their eyebrows and say, "You won't believe what he did next." And that was enough, because belief was secondary to transmission, and transmission was everything. And this meant that even infamous legacies were legacies worth having, because being remembered as a fool still beat not being remembered at all, and fading into obscurity wasn't a tragedy, it was the default setting, because most people's names were swallowed by time before they were even fully digested by the soil. And if your name outlasted your bones, you had won, even if the story attached to that name was 30% truth, 40% confusion, and 30% poetic license, issued by someone who couldn't read but loved the sound of their own voice. And in this way, legacy was a living creature, slippery, unpredictable, often rude, occasionally brilliant, and it fed on attention, on repetition, on the rare human tendency to speak of the past with reverence, even when that past was, in all likelihood, a complete mess. And Viking society knew this, accepted it, embraced it, and structured its entire sense of identity around it, because legacy was not just personal, tainted. It was familial, tribal, national, a woven cloth of tales meant to justify pride, explain trauma, or scare children into obedience. And each thread of that cloth came from someone who once lived, bled, and shouted their name at the sky in the hopes that someone would remember it later. And the cruel truth is that even if they didn't, the sky certainly didn't, the gods probably didn't, and your neighbors definitely didn't once they ran out of mead. And so your best bet was to do something, anything, worth retelling, and then pray that the right person was nearby to witness it, survive it, and exaggerate it to the next person down the fjord. And maybe, just maybe, your name would make it onto the tongue of a skald who needed a tragic figure, or a brave warrior, or a hilarious fool to balance out his ballad. And once that happened, your legacy was locked in, not accurate, not flattering, but eternal, in the way that smoke is eternal if no one bothers to open a window. And the lesson here, if there is one, is that you don't choose your legacy, you influence it slightly, and then hand it over to chaos. And chaos has terrible handwriting, but it gets the job done. And if by some miracle your memory survives a century, you can be certain it has nothing to do with who you were, and everything to do with who needed your story to mean something at the time, which is why legacy is never about you, it's about them, the ones who forget you last. Old age in Viking times was not a reward but a contradiction, a strange survival in a culture built on early death, where the ideal man died young, bloodied, screaming, and already halfway to Valhalla. And if you didn't manage that, then congratulations, you were now part of the awkward minority that lived long enough to become furniture, not legacy, because the elderly in Norse society were not necessarily revered, but rather endured, like harsh weather or a bad smell, and tolerated because they came with the territory, not because they brought wisdom anyone wanted to hear. And for every tale of a respected elder, there were 10 more of frail bodies left in corners, barely spoken to, their opinions given less value than the barking of a half-blind dog. And still, somehow, you've lived this long, waking each morning with another bone that doesn't bend, another tooth that doesn't chew, and the growing realization that nobody remembers the last time you were feared or even mildly respected, because all they see now is the cracked leather skin and hands that shake even when they're not cold. And when the younger generation passes you in the longhouse, they don't make eye contact, not out of respect but out of discomfort, as if aging might be contagious. And perhaps it is, at least the way your cough sounds like a prophecy no one wants to hear, and your stories, once bold retellings of battles and raids, now stumble over forgotten names and misplaced details. And when you pause to remember who you killed on the coast of Northumbria, the children roll their eyes and go back to sharpening their axes. Because what matters is the next raid, not the one where you lost half your ear and gained a limp that never fully healed. And while the skalds still sing of brave warriors and glorious deaths, your name is notably absent, not because you weren't brave, but because you didn't die when the story needed you to. And now you're in the inconvenient part of life, where everything you do takes longer, hurts more, and matters less, and your only real contribution is your ability to sit still and not die in the middle of dinner. And yet, despite this erosion of relevance, you persist, not out of spite, but out of habit, because the body, like a poorly built longship, keeps floating even after it should have sunk. And this persistence is not romantic. It's exhausting, a series of days filled with dull aches, occasional panic, and the creeping fear that you've outlived not just your enemies but your own usefulness. And while the occasional child might ask for a tale, they often interrupt, correcting you with the version they heard from someone younger, someone louder, and someone who wasn't there. And you're reminded that legacy is not about truth, it's about timing. And your timing was 20 winters ago, which means your legacy is now being slowly rewritten by people who never smelled the burning thatch or heard the cries, only the version with better pacing and a catchy refrain. And so you sit there, chewing with 3 teeth, wrapped in wool, watching a world you no longer control, no longer influence, no longer even fully understand. And you wonder what the point of all those years was, all those deaths survived, all those scars earned, if all it earns you now is a place near the fire and a bowl that arrives last and empties first. And even when the gods are mentioned, you feel less like a potential guest of Valhalla and more like an administrative error they haven't corrected yet, because Odin doesn't answer prayers from people who nap through midday, and the Shieldmaidens don't visit men who forget where they left their own walking stick. And so your afterlife feels like a distant rumor, your glory a vague memory, and your present a slow grey echo of who you once were. And yet, there's something defiant in continuing, something profoundly irritating to the young, who imagine that age makes you docile, when in truth it often makes you sharper, colder, less forgiving, and you find yourself muttering truths no one wants to hear, about the softness of their hands, the hollowness of their victories, the way their boasting sounds rehearsed. And they laugh, nervously, pretending not to care, but deep down they know. You have seen things they haven't yet survived, and that gives your brittle bones a strange kind of authority, like a haunted relic, respected not because it's useful, but because it's terrifyingly durable. And still, the days drag on, one indistinguishable from the next, marked by the same groans, the same wind, the same stew, and the same silence when you speak. And as the winters grow colder, and your body grows smaller, your memories become your only companions, flickering like torchlight in a damp hall, unreliable, but comforting. And you begin to realize that old age in this world is less a blessing and more a punishment doled out randomly, a kind of spiritual waiting room where you sit, indefinitely, hoping someone remembers to tell your story before you forget it yourself. And if they don't, well, you'll still be here tomorrow, cold, creaking, alive, and inconveniently unforgotten. When a Viking dies, what remains is not just a corpse but a question. Who will remember? And how inaccurately? Because the moment your breath leaves your lungs, your story no longer belongs to you. It belongs to those who stayed behind, and their ability to either immortalize you or misquote you entirely. And legacy, in this world, is not about truth. It's about who speaks the loudest at the feast and who owns the harp. Because songs are easier to write when the details are flexible. And you, inconveniently, were never very lyrical. So your legend may begin with an exaggerated battle, swell with an imaginary romance, and end with a poetic flourish you would have found absurd. But no one will ask you, because you're now wrapped in linen, dirt, or flames, depending on your family's budget and theological confidence, and the community, having buried you with solemn faces and secretly relieved sighs, will begin the slow, awkward process of rebranding your life as something meaningful, noble, and short enough to keep listeners entertained. And all the messy bits, the debts, the disputes, the part where you cried when your favorite goat died, those will be quietly excised in favor of a cleaner narrative, something more fitting for a drinking song or a fireside tale. And if you were lucky enough to die in battle, you'll be remembered as brave, no matter how you actually performed, because no one wants to sing about tripping over your own sword or mistaking your cousin's leg for the enemy. And if you died of disease, exposure, or an accident involving fermented fish and a torch, your story will be bent, gently but firmly, until it sounds like you meant to go out that way, like the gods themselves called you home with laughter and admiration, not with indifference and a strong breeze. And those who truly knew you, the ones who saw you bleed, falter, or forget, they will grieve in silence or not at all, because in this culture, mourning is a private insult to public stoicism, and tears are for women, slaves, or the very drunk, which often overlap, and so you become mythologized by necessity, not by merit, a figurehead for a ship you never boarded. And soon enough, even the details of your face begin to drift. Your voice becomes generic, your name pronounced with varying degrees of confidence depending on how much mead has been consumed, and in time, you become less a person than a placeholder, a story used to scare children or impress in-laws. And this is the true end, not the physical death but the narrative death, when the last person who knew what you actually looked like also dies or forgets, or simply chooses a more interesting version of you, and in that moment, you are truly free. Not remembered, not revered, just gone. And in a society that prizes glory, you begin to realize that the ones who vanish quickly might be the luckier ones, because the longer you linger in the communal memory, the more distorted you become, stretched like old wool over a story that no longer fits you. And while the skalds sing of eternal fame, the truth is that most names are lost within 3 generations, buried beneath newer songs, louder deeds, and flashier corpses. So what they say about you depends on who's left, how drunk they are, and whether or not your life makes them feel better about theirs. Because stories aren't about honoring the dead, they're about comforting the living. And you are just the vessel for their projections, fears, and punchlines. And maybe, if you're lucky, your story gets carved into stone, but more likely, it gets carved into memory, which is softer, shiftier, and disappears completely when the right people die at the wrong time. And that is your legacy, a gamble, a rumor, a slightly embellished ending to someone else's evening.